Hello again. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back to finish part 2 of Revelation. Revelation is an interesting and challenging book, and it's so detailed and so full of imagery that I can't explain it to you. Okay, and what all the imagery means. If you look at William Barclay's book, which is what I use, this is the second volume. He wrote 460 pages on Revelation. Revelation's only 21 chapters in the Bible. And this great scholar wrote 460 pages trying to explain the fabulous imagery involved. So I can't explain that to you. So I'm going to give you an overview of what do I think this book means to modern people. And the basic issue is I don't think it means much. When you go through it, and Barclay confirms this, and everybody who looks at it confirms it, the writer, John of Patmos, whoever he was beforehand, really hated the Roman Empire. This book is probably written about 95, and its reasons for hating the Roman Empire are fairly clear and easy to describe. One is that it locked him up in a cave on the island of Patmos off the coast of what's now Turkey. So if I got locked up, that might make me mad. The second thing is that and this does not get mentioned in here in any of the text, and Barclay doesn't mention it either. The guy very clearly comes from a very Jewish background. He's quoting all kinds of Jewish scriptures. So he comes from the Jewish background, and a lot of Christians came from Jewish background. That wasn't that unusual. But don't forget that the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, flattened it during a revolt against Rome. And then the third thing, there were a lot of reasons that he was offended by the Roman Empire. Was the Roman Empire brutal? Yeah. Every empire is brutal. That's how empires survive. Was it corrupt? Of course. Most governments are corrupt in some fashion. Was it very materialistic and greedy? Absolutely. But so are we as a culture, very materialistic and greedy. And so, you can look at that issue that he had a lot of issues to complain about, but many of those are endemic in government itself, particularly in empires. And we've seen in our lifetime a lot of empires disappear. That when I was young, the various European powers had empires all over Africa. Those are all gone. There's a few islands under the British and the French and the Dutch scattered around because they prefer to stay with them. So we've seen empires fade. The most obvious collapse of an empire that we've really seen, because the British and the French and the Dutch, and that was different. Of course, the biggest collapse was the Soviet Empire. In the reign of Papa Bush, it just kind of folded up, fell apart, and collapsed. That's kind of classic for empire destruction. But he assumes, and it's an interesting point, is that what I pick up here is the lack of the love and forgiveness and generosity that are the hallmarks of the New Testament. Jesus would occasionally have very short statements about the fate of certain non-believers. They're going to suffer this and that. But he didn't go on and on and on and on and on about this. He talked about the need to forgive your brother 70 times 7 when he offends you. That you had to love your neighbor. You had to turn the other cheek. And when they brought him the woman caught in adultery, he doesn't lecture her for half an hour about what's going to happen to her evil sins. He tells her, go and sin no more. I agree. That's good advice for all of us because we're all sinners. So this book is totally different in its attitude toward people and weaknesses and all that than the rest of the New Testament is. So it stands out as not being a classic Christian book, because even Paul talks about the importance over and over and over again in all the epistles. We need to love each other. If we don't love each other, we're not going to be successful. We need to forgive each other. And God forgives us with his grace. You don't find any of this in Revelation. I mean, none at all. So you can argue about it. Did God hate the Roman Empire? Maybe. I don't really know. But he sure used the Roman Empire to spread Christianity. This is an important point to remember for this. It's no mistake that Jesus came on earth. It's all part of the plan. It's not any accidents or anything like that. Jesus came at a particular time at the peak of the power and success of the Roman Empire. And what do I mean? Well, you understand you had one universal imperial government that covered the area from east of the Jordan River over toward where the current border between Iraq and Jordan is out in the desert. From there, all the way across North Africa, up including Spain and Portugal, all of France, up into England. They really didn't try to conquer Scotland. It really wasn't worth it at the time. Cutting along the Rhine, didn't have northern Germany, but it had southern Germany and Austria and Switzerland in that area. Down across Central Europe, all of the Balkans, Greece in that area, all of Turkey, Asia Minor. That was all under one government. So that meant that there were no restrictions on travel. You could leave Jerusalem as an itinerant preacher like Paul did. You could walk up through Asia Minor, through what's now Turkey. You could cross across the Aegean, no customs, no borders, no nothing, no restriction like that. He had an itinerant evangelist that covered the whole empire. Christianity moved quickly into Egypt. They could walk into Egypt. They could walk all the way down to the Straits of Gibraltar. That's all one government. The Romans built very good roads. Why did they build very good roads? They built very good roads to move their military around to defend their borders. And they did provide an enormous amount of stability. So you had easy transportation, good roads. You had an enormous stability. The external borders were stable. They had to fight at various times. The groups to the east of Jordan were attacking it. But a lot of the friction along the northern borders in Europe was that the tribes wanted to join the Roman Empire, not overthrow it. They wanted to join it because it was stable and prosperous. So when you had free travel, you had free trade. So free trade means people get wealthier because trade is what brings wealth. They had good road system, and they had swept the pirates from the Mediterranean. When they talk about the danger of Paul's cruising, going to Rome and shipwrecked on Malta and all that, the danger was the weather. There was no mention of pirates in any of Paul's travels because the Romans had swept the pirates of the Mediterranean. You wouldn't want to be a pirate and get caught by the Romans. I mean, exactly what they would do to you, I don't know, but you didn't want to do that. And people could say, so they produced all these fantastic things that even though they were brutal and corrupt and obsessed with sexuality, they allowed Christianity to expand. Did they crucify Jesus? They sure did. But that was part of the plan. You couldn't have a resurrection unless you'd had a public crucifixion. So it was all part of the plan. So I don't think God particularly hated the Roman Empire. He used it. Remember, within 300 years of the crucifixion, the Christians took over the Roman Empire. Constantine was a Christian in about 317, 318. Council of Nicaea was 325. They were totally dominating the Roman Empire at that time. They had some things back and forth. But if you look at the reality, they didn't hate the Roman Empire. God didn't. God used the Roman Empire, and that's what spread Christianity all across Europe, all through the Eastern world. So it's a very interesting thing. So in a strange way, John got it wrong. God didn't hate the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire wasn't trying to destroy Christianity. Did it have periodic persecution? Yeah, and they had some about his time. They began to put in some emphasis on emperor worship, where you had to sacrifice to this deified emperor, and that may have particularly stuck in his craw. And that was happening about the time he wrote this. That probably was the thing that implemented, but that was sporadic. It was implemented or not implemented locally. There's an interesting communication about 100 AD between a guy who was ruling in Western Turkey area, and he talked to his friend the emperor about the Christians, and what do I do with these people? And I examine them, and if they're this, I punish them. And the emperor writes back and says, that sounds okay to me. You did all right, but don't go looking for these people, because he had told the emperor, these people don't make any trouble. Their neighbors complain about them because they're not buying silver idols of the gods and stuff like that. And they're not coming to the festivals, but they meet before dawn. They have a meal together. They sing hymns and they pray. They don't make any trouble. And there's very clear instructions in Paul and Peter's letters. Work with the authorities. Don't tangle with the authorities. So the Christians in general tried to lie low, practice their faith, and be left alone, like you would if you were a Christian in China right now. So it's a very interesting thing that this complicated book is written with all this imagery, and when you look back on it, that's not what happened to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was not destroyed by God in this massive trauma or anything like that. Conflagration, excuse me, I couldn't get that word out. It faded away and kind of collapsed under its own weight. It actually split in two, and the Eastern Roman Empire lasted until 1450, when Constantinople fell, and the Roman Empire in the West fell about 450 or so. You can debate it, kind of faded away, but you didn't have this. So it's an interesting thing. This really didn't happen. Now, where did this writing come from? What's the background for this kind of writing? Do you have it in the Old Testament? Yes, you do. You have it in two places in the Old Testament. In the book of Ezekiel, most of you have never studied Ezekiel because it's full of this kind of doom and gloom and the world's going to end writing, because Ezekiel was written when the author was living in exile, in oppression in the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire was really, really, really nasty. They had conquered the Jews and taken them out of Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem, moved them over east to Babylon. And so at the time, he's angry and he's predicting the end of the Babylonian Empire. That happened. Cyrus the Great, the Persian, came up, and the Babylonians were so happy to get rid of their old people. They welcomed Cyrus. He had a reputation for being a magnanimous and generous guy. Now, there are reports that locals threw the gates open and let him in. He let the Hebrew people, you want to go back to Jerusalem? Fine. You want to worship the God the way you want to? Fine. I don't care. And he provided imperial security, and they were very loyal to him. The second episode is at the latter part of Daniel. Now, everything, people remember the Lion's Den and Daniel. If you read the back 2/3 of it, it's all this what's called apocryphal writing, all this doom and gloom and battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and the world's going to come to an end. Because by that time, the Persian Empire was gone. The Greek rulers who had succeeded Alexander, remember, conquered the whole Persian Empire and then died in his 30s. And his generals took over, and so they were ruling ruthlessly and brutally and corruptly, and that's when Daniel was written, and the Maccabean rebellion came and threw them out about 170. But in that time frame between Daniel about 300 and the time frame of Jesus and the Christian movement, about 400-year period, there was extensive writings and what's called, I'm going to hold this up, pseudegraphia. These are writings that claim to be by Moses and Enoch and all these people, and they're really written during that time frame. And this pattern of literature is very much what's predicted here. You had the end of the world and all this cosmic battle and these terrible things, and God's going to take his revenge, et cetera, et cetera. So this is 1,000 pages. There's a second volume here, which is also 1,000 pages. I bought these. I haven't read them. I haven't been that bored yet, even in retirement, that I can slog through 2,000 pages of this kind of writing. But that's really the predecessor to Revelation. It follows in that tradition. It's very much in that same thing. So it's an evolution. And I think, as I said last week, one of the reasons that it gets in the Christian text is they didn't know what to do with it. It goes way back to the beginning, about 95. The Bible isn't firmed up until the 4th century, between 325 and 365. And so this text had been hanging around for a long time. One of the criteria was that the text had to be ancient, to look back to the 1st century or before. They had to claim apostolic authority. This guy was John, and they had to meet the new emerging Orthodox theology. Well, there really isn't any clear theology in Revelation. It's all this fire and brimstone, et cetera, et cetera. So, and they didn't know what to do with it. Eusebius, who helped create the New Testament, had 3 categories: authoritative, disputed, and spurious. And Revelation was in all 3 of them because he didn't know what to do with it. So you could argue, well, maybe we really shouldn't pay much attention to it because it's not clear why it got in. It was not clear what the message is. What's the message for modern Christianity? Is the world going to come to an end? Sure, it will eventually. Is the doom and gloom going to happen in our lifetime? I think it's extremely unlikely because the Roman Empire's come and gone and the big thing they're talking about. So I'm going to touch on a few of the images that came in here, and you can like it or not, that some of these major major figures appear. Jesus appears as the Lamb. He's got signs of sacrifice on the Lamb. This is the Lamb of God. Then in the 12th chapter, you come up with a dragon, and the dragon is Satan, or the devil, however you want to describe it. And Satan is an enigmatic character in the Old Testament. He's a member of the heavenly court in Job. He really was more of an advocate rather than a devil. And the concept of Satan being cast down from heaven comes from these books, the Pseudegraphia written in between. So he emerges as this evil character, the force behind evil, not in the Old Testament, not at all, because in Job he's a member of the heavenly court, but in this Pseudegraphia. Also, this is where the concept of archangels appear, Michael and various other archangels appears in this literature, even though it's come into our understanding that way. So the dragon is Satan, or the devil, and in the New Testament there are three different terms in the Synoptic Gospels about Jesus being tempted. One of them says Satan, one of them says the devil, one of them says the tempter. So they're really not the same terminology, even for this character, which has changed from a member of the heavenly court to a challenge, a feature of evil. The beast in this thing is clearly the Roman Empire. This is what John particularly hated, and he regards it as the enemy of God and Christ, because he didn't live long enough to see that God actually used the Roman Empire to spread Christianity throughout the European and the Eastern and North Africa and Egypt and everything. So he preaches this violent overthrow of these evil forces. The problem is that didn't happen. Just didn't happen. The Roman Empire kind of faded away and had been taken over by the Christianity since that time, which used the structure of the empire and the spread of the empire and the stability it offered. It allowed them to spread through much of Europe and actually all from North Africa and the Middle East because of the Roman Empire. So it's an interesting thing that it really didn't happen. So he predicts this violent struggle, and the overthrow did happen to Babylon. That was from Ezekiel in the Old Testament. It did happen to the people predicting it in the Greek Empire, which fell down. But Christianity took over the Roman Empire, and it did not collapse like this. So we'll have a little fun here and show you. Then it talks about Armageddon. People are familiar with the term of Armageddon. Can you get this in, Eric?
Hold it up a little bit.
That's Megiddo up there, up high. This is from down below. It's a mountain fortress.
Yeah, when you angled it back, you could see it.
Could you see it that way?
Angle it back to it.
Oop.
There you go.
Okay, well, it came unplugged, so I don't know that. And that's the view. No, that's not it. Where are we going here? There it is. And this is the top of it. It's an ancient fortress.
Perfect.
There's been multiple battles there. I'll show you one more slide and you'll see why. And this is the view down from there. This is called the Valley of the Jezreel. And so this valley runs from the coastal plain down on the Mediterranean up to the inland. So if you're in Egypt and you're going to attack up into Damascus, Syria, then you're going to come up by Megiddo, go up the Valley of the Jezreel, and attack them up in Syria. So that's really where it is. There's been lots and lots of battles there. So the reason it's identified as the site of the final battle is because there's lots and lots of battles. It's a natural fortress. It's a great view from up there. The last of battles is supposed to happen there, but hadn't happened yet. They have some other references to this 1,000-year periods, the millennia. You're going to be cast under the abyss for 1,000 years, then you're going to come back. There's going to be something else for 1,000 years, and that's often kind of burned down. Also, when 1000 AD was coming, some of the people were very concerned the world was going to come to an end and everything was going to collapse around them, and it didn't. The world continued. We remember the Y2K. Remember that, where people were worried that in the year 2000 when we turned over, we'd have some kind of catastrophe and everything would fall apart. I wasn't too worried. I got some more money out of the ATM in case the ATMs went on the fritz. But otherwise, I went New Year's Eve. My wife and daughter went to a concert, and I went to a movie. And the world didn't come to an end. And they played football the next day on January 1st, and life went on. So this worry about this magic of a millennial period, that comes from Revelation, and that's come and gone on its own way. And after the triumph, when you get in the last part, chapter 19 and 20 and 21, then you have these images of heaven. It's very interesting because one of the complaints against the Roman Empire John has was it was obsessed with wealth. But the heaven he presents is very materialistic. It's got streets of gold, it has gates of pearl, it has all kinds of other jewels around it, extremely materialistic heaven. Totally different than that's unique, nobody really knows. And one time when they asked Jesus what was heaven going to be like, they're asking about the woman who'd had 6 husbands, they'd each died, and when she gets to heaven, what's it going to be like? And he says, it isn't like that. He doesn't say, it's interesting, the only person who knew what heaven was like, who walked the earth, wouldn't tell us what it was like. He said, it isn't like that. So I don't know what it's like. It's not my impression from that description from Jesus that it's pearly gates and jewels and streets of gold and all that. And I think it's living in beauty with the Lord, and that's pretty much what I think of it. So anyway, I'm going to take a deep breath here, and you can see my reluctance to take this book seriously. I think it's got a lot of, and I know some people who just love it. They love the imagery, and I'm not a person who's into fantasy and things like that, and a lot of splashy imagery doesn't mean much. But I think in the end, it really doesn't offer us anything. It doesn't offer us solutions as to how we're to behave ourselves as Christians. It doesn't offer us how we deal with the non-believers, how we deal with our own weaknesses, how we deal with all the difficulties in life. And it's all this extrapolation about what was going to happen, and people think that they can predict the future. I know I can't predict the future, and I'll be happy if I get it right about tomorrow. And so I think it's been, even Barclay says that it had been great mischief from this book. And so I think we should give it very little credence, very little attention, very little following, because it's really not offered much to the church in general, and it clearly doesn't offer much to us now in modern Christianity. We have to have faith, we have to love, we have to support each other, we have to forgive our enemies. Remember, we get to forgive them 7 times 7, and hope on God's grace for our salvation, because we're all sinners. So I'm going to stop there, but not quite. What we're going to do, this will finish this part of the New Testament. Our plan is to go on and go back to the Gospels and do the lessons that we've already done live in the church. Remember, this started about December. And so we'll go through the 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the part of John that we haven't done. We finished the last lesson in John. And we'll do all those to get them all posted up on the YouTube. And we'll probably be done around Christmas time. Probably take a couple weeks off at Christmas. Then I'm considering what to do, even if we're back into meeting in live Sunday school, which I doubt. But we may want to do highlights of the Old Testament and get all that posted to YouTube so people can look at it at their own leisure. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie.